The coat creaks when I lift it, the old wool stiff with time, its dark brown fibers still faintly smelling of damp earth and smoke. I'm standing in a small back room of the county museum, the kind of room where the air stays cool and the lights hum softly overhead. This coat was donated only last week, folded carefully in a box that had been sealed for almost a century. Tonight I'm opening it for the first time, smoothing my hands over the worn seams, when my fingers pause on a section of stitching that doesn't belong. A ridge in the lining. A pocket, hidden by hand. This is Mother's lost war letters, where we bring to light the words mothers and sons never had the chance to hear in time. Letters written during the Great Wars, tucked away in fear or hope, lost in transit, or buried in silence, only to surface decades later. These aren't stories of generals or battlefields. They are the quiet truths of families who waited and waited and waited. The letter inside this coat, just a thin rectangle of brittle paper, was never delivered. Whoever stitched it there must have done it quickly, their thread unsteady, their heart racing in the dark of a farmhouse after hearing a knock on the door. Tonight, for the first time since the end of World War I, we're going to unfold what a mother meant for her son to read before he marched back into a world that was swallowing men his age by the hour. If you stay with me, you'll hear what she was too afraid to say aloud. Words she folded into this lining with hands that must have shaken. Words her son never received. Someone in this family lived an entire lifetime without knowing what was hidden here, and what I'm holding now carries the kind of truth that softens and breaks at the same time. There's a scent rising from the paper as I ease it free. Old ink, old hope, a trace of the farmhouse kitchen where this letter must have been written by the glow of a single lamp. The texture is fragile, edges frayed, as if the years pressed their own fingerprints into it. Outside the museum windows, the last light of evening slips across the glass, turning everything a muted gold. It feels like the kind of hour when someone might have waited for footsteps that never came. This letter was written by a mother to her son, a young soldier who had already seen more than she ever wanted for him. The coat came home without him. The letter never did. And now, nearly a century later, her great-grandson has unknowingly returned her voice to the world. If stories like this stay with you, please like this video and subscribe to Mother's Lost War Letters so these voices are never lost again. I'm unfolding the page now. Its creases open slowly, like something waking after a long sleep. The ink glimmers faintly under the lamp. Tonight, we finally read what she never got to say in time. The hidden pocket gives way with a soft tear, the old thread parting as if it had been waiting for a hand patient enough to coax it open. The letter slips into my palm, lighter than I expect, almost weightless, though the years around it feel heavy. I sit at a narrow wooden table in the museum's back room, the coat laid out beside me, its sleeves shaped by time into a faint memory of the young man who once wore it. There is a single button missing on the right cuff, and beneath it, a faint patch of dried mud clings stubbornly to the wool, earth from a field that no one has walked in for generations. I smooth the letter against the light. The handwriting is compact but careful, the ink browned with age, each stroke pressed into the paper as if the writer tried to steady her hand on a night when steadiness was impossible. A faint scent lingers, dust, old smoke, and something like dried lavender. And beneath all of that, the unmistakable smell of cold soil. The coat carried it home. The farmhouse where this letter was written must have been quiet when she sat down. Quiet in that tense way country homes become when the world outside is louder than anything inside. I can imagine her in the small kitchen, the one window covered with a blanket to hide any glow from enemy aircraft overhead. A kettle pushed off the flame, a chair pulled close to the table. her pen scratching over paper as she listened for footsteps she already feared would not return. I opened the letter fully. The edges crack softly. "My dear boy," she begins, the words slanting slightly to the right. "I am writing this while the lamp burns low and the house feels too large without your boots by the door." The shift into her voice is immediate, like stepping into a memory she left behind. I can almost feel the pen trembling in her hand as she wrote, the way she must have paused to breathe when the ink pooled too dark in one corner. She writes about the everyday things first, as mothers do when they're trying not to show fear. How the hens have stopped laying with the cold, how the neighbor brought firewood, how she patched the tear in his scarf and left it on his chair in case he was sent home on short notice. "I boiled potatoes tonight," she writes, "the way you like them, with butter and salt if we have enough for both. I kept your plate warm longer than I care to admit." There is tenderness in her words, the kind that aches. I can see her stirring a pot with one hand while wiping her eyes with the other, determined not to let the tears fall where he might see them if he walked in unexpectedly. The early winter wind must have rattled the window above the sink. I imagine her glancing at it, holding her breath, wondering if it was a branch or a knock. She describes the morning before he left, how he had tried to seem brave while fastening the top button of his uniform coat, the same one lying beside me now. The button is here, polished once by her hands, a dull shine left behind. "He wouldn't look at me when I asked if he was frightened," she writes. "He said it was nothing, that everyone else was going, that it was only right. But I saw the way his fingers trembled when he tied his boots." Her voice pauses on the page. I can almost hear it. "I wish your father had lived to see you," she continues, "though perhaps it is better he did not see this. The war took enough from him. It has no right to take you too." The phrasing is gentle but firm, as if she is trying to steady her own courage by writing it down. Outside her kitchen window, she writes, the neighbor's boy was chasing a dog through the frost-covered yard, his laughter sharp and bright against the cold. A small petala, a moment she captured not for drama, but because she saw her son's childhood reflected in it. Because she remembered a time when war was an echo from faraway places, not a shadow hanging over the doorway. "That boy reminds me of you when you were 10, she writes, "running through the orchard with your collar half turned and your cheeks red from the wind. I used to call after you to be careful with the branches, but you never listened. You only laughed and kept running." The contrast between that small memory and the uniform coat on my table is almost unbearable. She continues, "I straighten your bed each morning. I know you would roll your eyes and tell me to leave it be, but it helps me feel that a part of you is still here. The quilt still smells like the soap you use, and I keep the window cracked just enough to let in the air you always said made the room feel like home." There is a smear of ink beneath that line. Her hand must have slipped. Her tone deepens gently, the shift subtle but certain. "There is talk in the village," she writes. "Some say the fighting is worse now, that fewer boys will make it home for Christmas. But I refuse to believe that. I have to believe you will walk through that door again with your shoulders straight and your boots muddy and your voice asking what's for supper. I keep imagining the moment. I carry it with me." She describes her ritual of waiting at dusk, the same hour every day, her temporal loop when the last light hits the hills and the world feels suspended. She stands by the window, her hands resting on the back of his chair, watching the road, listening for footsteps, listening for his. "Every evening," she writes, "I light a candle and place it near the door. It is foolish, perhaps, but I hope the glow will guide you home if the night grows too dark." A second smear appears, larger this time. Her words soften, almost whisper on the page. I know you left this morning with your scarf tucked under your collar just the way I showed you when you were small. I watched you walk down the lane. You didn't look back. I told myself it was because you were being brave. You have always tried so hard to be brave for me. The ink thins toward the bottom of the page, as if she wrote the last lines in lamplight that was starting to fade. If this letter reaches you, please know that your place is here. Your boots by the door, your laughter in the house. Come home to me, my boy. Come home while there is still time. Her handwriting trails off, unfinished, as if she meant to add something more but couldn't bear to write it. I look back at the coat beside me, at the missing button on the cuff, at the hidden stitches she must have sewn after folding this letter. The room feels impossibly still, as if the past has pressed against the present. The paper grows thinner as I turn the page, as if the years have worn down its strength. But her voice holds. The ink shifts slightly in color, darker in some strokes, lighter in others. The way a pen behaves when someone pauses too long or presses too hard. The second sheet begins without greeting, as though she was afraid to lose her courage if she started over. Outside the farmhouse, the night must have deepened, the wind carrying the distant hum of artillery that sometimes drifted across the countryside when the front line shifted. Still she wrote, leaning close to the lamp, holding her breath whenever the flame flickered. She begins with the future, an act of defiance in itself. She writes about the coming spring, the way the orchard would bloom again if frost didn't claim the early blossoms. She tells him she wants to plant potatoes in the far end of the field where the soil is dark and rich. The place where he once built a small fort out of stones when he was no more than 6. She writes that she hopes he'll be there to help with the planting, that he can take the heavier sacks this time so she doesn't strain her shoulder like last year. She imagines them laughing together about it, wiping soil from their palms, leaning against the fence to catch their breath. Then she writes about Christmas, a Christmas she imagines will feel whole if he returns. She describes the goose she wants to roast, the way the skin will crackle in the heat of the oven, how she would braid dough for the holiday bread and sprinkle it with the last bit of sugar she's been saving for months. She tells him she has kept the wooden soldier he carved when he was 12, the one with the crooked helmet, and that she plans to place it on the mantle again, just as she did every year before he left. But beneath her hopeful plans, a contradiction emerges. She mentions a date for the holiday meal, December the 24th, and beneath it, faintly visible, a second date crossed out. It is earlier by several days. She must have written the first date by instinct, then crossed it out after remembering the strict restrictions on letters leaving the village, or the fact that many boys wouldn't be allowed home even if the war slowed for a moment. The crossed-out date sits like a bruise on the page, noticeable enough that any reader now can see the tension she tried to hide. She shifts toward memory, the way mothers do when they reach for strength. She tells him she still remembers the morning she walked him to school for the first time, the frost on the grass, and the sound of his small boots clapping against the dirt road. She recalls how he refused to let go of her skirt when they reached the gate, his fingers curled tight, his eyes wide. She describes kneeling down and telling him that bravery isn't loud, sometimes it is quiet and trembling. She writes that he nodded then, took a breath, and walked inside with his chin tilted up, though he looked back 3 times before disappearing into the doorway. Another memory follows closely, tied to illness. She recalls the week he had a fever so high she feared it would take him from her. She describes sitting by his bed through the long nights, dipping a cloth in cool water, whispering that morning would come soon. When he finally opened his eyes, she says, he asked for bread. She baked 3 loaves that very day, even though she had to borrow flour from the neighbor. She admits she cried into the dough without noticing. A small vignette appears then, a petala drifting in from the margins of her life. She writes about the boy who delivers newspapers in the village, how he shouted the headlines outside her fence that afternoon. More casualties, more uncertainty, more sons whose boots would never return home. She describes watching him struggle to fold the papers in the cold, his fingers red and clumsy, and realizing he couldn't be more than 12. The thought pierced her, boys so young, carrying news of boys only slightly older who were already gone. She writes of the kitchen next, the same kitchen she described earlier, but now with more detail, as if she wants him to remember it clearly. She tells him about the jar of preserved cherries she's been saving, the last from the previous summer, and how she promised herself she wouldn't open it until he came home. She describes the quilt draped over the back of his chair, the one stitched by her mother long ago, frayed at the edges but still warm. She writes that she has been reading his favorite story at night, out loud to the empty room, just to hear the sound of her own voice soften the silence. She admits she feels foolish doing it, but she keeps reading anyway. Midway down the page, another subtle inconsistency appears, small but sharp. She mentions that she wrote to him the previous week, sending the letter by railway courier to a certain battalion post. But the battalion she names is different from the one written on the envelope tucked into the coat. The unit number has changed by a single digit, easy to miss, easy to mistake. She must not have known he had been transferred or that the routing system for mail had shifted yet again. The ink around that line is faint, as if the pen was running low or she hesitated before finishing. She moves gently into another memory, this one tender enough to tremble. She recalls the morning his father left for the fields years before the war took him. She remembers the sound of the gate closing, the steady rhythm of boots along the path, the way her husband turned once to wave before disappearing down the hill. She tells her son that on that day, she prayed he would inherit his father's kindness, not his stubborn pride. And she writes that when she looks at him now, grown, tall, trying so hard not to be afraid, she sees both. She describes the farmhouse as if she's moving through it while writing. She mentions the creak of the floorboards near the pantry, the draft beneath the front door, the way the rafters hum when the wind turns colder. She writes about the sound of the clock in the kitchen, its slow, steady ticking marking each hour she spends waiting. This is her chosen loop, time passing in ways she cannot control, her life measured in ticks and tocks while the world beyond her walls unravels. She writes that every time the clock strikes 7 in the evening, she pauses whatever she's doing, closes her eyes, and thinks of him. She imagines he feels it somehow. The candle on her table burns low, she says. She mentions that the wick has begun to curl and the halo of light no longer reaches the corners of the room. She wonders if he is somewhere cold at this very moment, and she wishes she could tuck the quilt around his shoulders the way she did when he was small. She apologizes for these thoughts, saying she knows he wouldn't want her to picture him shivering. But a mother's mind wanders even when she tries to hold it still. There is a moment in the letter when she seems to falter. She writes, "If the war ends soon," then scratches out the words so firmly that the paper nearly tears. Beneath the inked-over line, faint but still visible, is another phrase. "If it takes you from me." She must have realized what she was writing and refused to accept it. Instead, she begins anew. "When you come home, we will fix the fence behind the barn, and I will show you the recipe your grandmother taught me before she passed. The one you always said smelled like comfort." As the letter continues, she allows herself a quiet confession. She writes that she placed his childhood marble in the pocket of her apron before walking him to the lane on the morning of his departure. She says she meant to give it to him for luck, but couldn't bring herself to press it into his hand. Instead, she kept it close, turning it between her fingers as she watched him walk away. She writes that she still keeps it near, sometimes slipping it into her pocket when she goes to the well or tends the garden, just to feel the weight of him there. She pauses to describe the fields again, now covered in frost, now silent except for crows on the fence posts. She writes that she imagines him walking through the same fields when he returns, stopping to look at the bare trees, breathing the air that carried his childhood laughter. She says she will be waiting on the porch when he comes up the path, hands clasped, heart steady, ready to listen to anything he wants to say or anything he wants to keep quiet. She promises there will be no questions he cannot refuse, no burdens he must carry alone. The letter begins to draw towards something deeper, though she does not name it. She writes that there are things she has kept from him, truths she meant to tell him when the time was right. She says she is afraid the war may steal her chance. She hints at a debt his father left behind, at a decision she made years ago to protect him, at a name she refused to speak in fear of reopening old wounds. She writes that she still hopes to explain all of it to him in person, sitting at the kitchen table with the evening light stretching across the floor, but then she stops. The sentence ends abruptly, the period barely formed. It is as if she decided this was not the night to reveal everything. She must have intended to keep some truths close until she saw him again, until she could read the look in his eyes and know whether he was ready to hear them. Her final lines on this sheet return to gentler ground. She writes that she folded his scarf and placed it in the drawer beside hers so they would be together in the dark. She writes that she swept the hearth and laid fresh logs by the fire, imagining him stepping through the door, stamping the cold from his boots. She says she knows he is stronger than he realizes, braver than he believes, and that the world will never quiet her hope. The ink thins once more at the bottom of the page. The final line reads, "Wherever you are tonight, know that the light in this house waits for you." I look down at the coat beside me, the heavy wool holding the remnants of a life interrupted. The seam where she stitched the pocket is rough, the thread mismatched, as if she worked by instinct rather than craft. The missing button on the cuff catches the faint light, a small, silent marker of everything that was lost. The next sheet is thinner than the others, worn almost translucent in places where her pen pressed too hard or where moisture once touched the page. It begins without hesitation, as though something in her had shifted between one breath and the next. The kitchen lamp must have burned lower by then, its small circle of light drawing shadows long across the table. The house would have settled into that deep rural silence broken only by the pop of cooling wood or the faint click of the clock that measured each hour of her waiting. The wind outside must have pushed against the shutters with a trembling insistence, carrying with it distant sounds from a world she could not see but constantly feared. She writes first of a rumor that passed through the village that morning. A neighbor, she says, arrived at her gate with flour to lend, rare generosity in a time when every grain was rationed, and told her in a low voice that the fighting near the northern front had intensified. She describes the woman's face, pale beneath her scarf, and how she clutched the cloth bag with both hands as if bracing herself. "They say the trains are running slower," the neighbor whispered, "and some are not running at all." The words left a tremor on the page, the ink slightly thicker where her pen paused afterward. She writes about the new shortages announced by the local council. Coal cut in half, bread rationed again, the butcher unable to promise meat for the coming week. The nights have grown colder, she says, and the fields are brittle with frost. She describes scraping ice from the inside of her bedroom window with the edge of a spoon, watching her own breath cloud the glass. The winter feels sharper this year, she says, as if the wind itself carries a warning. Then she speaks, of the sirens, how they have begun to sound more often, not only in the towns, but even in the countryside. She writes that the last time the siren wailed, she was fetching water from the well. The bucket slipped from her hands and clattered against the stones, the sound echoing in the cold air. She dropped to her knees without thinking, heart pounding, remembering the stories of stray shells and wandering aircraft that had frightened all the villages recently. Nothing struck that day, but the echo of the siren stayed in her bones long after the quiet returned. A small vignette follows, a petala drifting in from the world beyond her door. She writes of passing the church that afternoon, its windows darkened to hide the faint glow of candles inside. The priest had propped the door open just enough for people to slip through quickly. She describes seeing a woman kneeling at the front pew, her shoulders shaking as she whispered a prayer for her son. The woman left a handkerchief on the bench, white, embroidered with tiny blue flowers, forgotten in her grief. "I wanted to return it to her," the mother writes, "but I did not know if stepping toward her would break something she was holding together." She turns inward then, her words tightening. She mentions that letters have been slow to arrive from the front, and some have not arrived at all. She writes of watching the postman walk the long road toward the village with his bag slung low, his expression growing heavier each day. She says she tries not to stare from the window, tries not to read the shape of his steps or the way he hesitates at gates, but she feels her breath catch every time he turns in her direction. "When he walks past my house," she writes, "I feel both relief and guilt. Relief that he carries no bad news for me, guilt that someone else must receive it instead." She describes a scene at the market, another small petal of life unchanged and yet changed entirely. A mother scolding her young son for running between the stalls, a soldier home on brief leave examining a pair of gloves but putting them back with a shake of his head when he saw the price, a vendor wrapping bread in thin paper, apologizing for how small the loaf had become. She writes that the market felt both alive and hollow, full of voices but low on hope. "Even the apples looked tired," she writes, "their skins dull, as if they too had endured too many cold nights." Her voice turns toward him again, her son who is somewhere far from the orchard and the small kitchen where she writes. She imagines him reading newspapers at camp, hearing rumors of troop movements, shivering in a coat that barely keeps out the cold. She wonders if he has enough to eat, if he has socks without holes, if he sleeps at all among the sounds of men calling out in their dreams. She writes that she sometimes wakes in the middle of the night convinced she heard his footsteps on the porch, only to find the house silent except for the steady ticking of the clock. She mentions the sound of that clock again, her loop tightening. "It struck 7 tonight," she writes, "and for a moment I felt you near. I placed my hand on your chair and closed my eyes. The wood was cold, but I pretended it was warm." She writes that she lit a candle at dusk, the way she always does, and placed it beside the door. She describes the small flame bending in the draft, the wax dripping slowly down the side, the faint smell of burning wick. She writes that the candle reminded her of him, stubborn, flickering, refusing to go out even when the wind shifts. Then the shadows gather more tightly on the page. She writes of a man who visited the village that week, a courier carrying news from the regiment. His boots were muddy, she says, and his voice tired, and the crowd that formed around him trembled with anticipation and dread. He read a list of names, some familiar, some not. When he read a name from a nearby farm, a woman cried out and collapsed into her husband's arms. The mother writes that she stepped backward, clutching the fence behind her, terrified that her son's name might be next. The world tilted. she writes, and I felt the sky press down on me. His name was not on the list, but the fear carved itself into her memory. She writes about the nights growing longer, the cold creeping beneath the door, no matter how many rags she stuffs into the cracks. She says she wakes before dawn and listens for birds. Some mornings there are none. She worries that the world is holding its breath. She writes that the ration book is nearly full of stamps now, each one a small surrender to the times, and she confesses she has kept aside a bit of sugar in a tin labeled "for his return," though she knows others might need it more. Then she writes about a story she heard in the village, whispered, uncertain, about a train carrying wounded soldiers that never reached its destination. They say the bridge failed, she writes. They say the river swallowed the cars whole. She does not mention it again, but the shadow of it falls across her next lines like a chill. Her words grow quieter as she turns back to their home. She describes walking into his room and opening the curtains just enough to let in the pale winter light. Dust motes drifted in the beam, she says, and settled softly on his books, his folded shirts, the small wooden box where he once kept feathers and stones and tiny treasures he gathered from the fields. She writes that she touched the quilt on his bed, smoothing it with her palm, and whispered his name into the stillness. A subtle hint appears, a quiet foreshadowing she does not realize she has left. She writes that she has kept his birth certificate in the drawer beneath her scarves, and that she checks it sometimes, not for comfort, but to reassure herself that the world once recorded his beginning, and therefore should not steal his ending. But she mentions a name crossed out on the document, a correction made in haste years ago. She does not explain it. She simply notes it, then moves on. She writes of hearing distant thunder that evening, only to realize it wasn't thunder at all. The ground trembled slightly, the windows rattled in their frames. She sat down at the table with her hands gripping the edge, waiting for the silence to return. When it did, she breathed out slowly, as though releasing something she had been holding for far too long. Then comes another vignette, this one from the lane behind the house. She describes seeing an old man walking with a lantern, its yellow light swaying in the wind as he searched for something he had dropped. His spectacles, she thinks. She offered to help, but he shook his head gently and said he manages better alone. She writes that as he walked away, the lantern's light bobbed like a small star drifting along the path, and for a moment she imagined her son following such a light back home. The tension continues to rise in her words, each sentence narrowing the space around her. She writes that she heard the postman's whistle today, sharp and thin, and her heart leapt so hard she had to steady herself on the counter. But the postman walked past her gate again. She describes the sting of relief and disappointment mingled so tightly that she didn't know which feeling was stronger. Near the bottom of the page, her handwriting changes pace, slower, heavier. She writes that she has begun to dream of him more often, dreams where he stands at the foot of her bed, saying nothing, only watching her with eyes that look older than they should. She wakes from these dreams with her heart pounding, the sheets damp with sweat, unsure if the dream is a comfort or a warning. She ends the page abruptly, as though something outside the farmhouse interrupted her. The final line reads, "If only I could hear your voice tonight." The sentence fades into a faint line, the ink thinned by fear or by exhaustion. There is no period. I fold the page gently, feeling the tremor of the unwritten words beneath my fingertips. The coat beside me seems heavier now, as if it has been listening to the letter too. The missing button on the cuff glints softly in the dim museum light, reflecting the shape of the room like a small eye that has witnessed everything and remained silent for a century. The next sheet feels different beneath my fingertips, slightly rougher, as though her hand trembled while writing, pressing more firmly than before. The edges carry faint signs of moisture, as if a drop of water once landed there and dried slowly, leaving a pale ring behind. When I ease the paper into the light, the ink reveals a change in her voice, not in tone, but in weight. Something has shifted inside her. The hope is still present, but it tightens, pulling closer to the bone. She begins with the morning light, thin, washed out, struggling to pass through the frost-laced window. She writes that she woke before dawn, startled by a dream so vivid she could not shake it. In the dream, she says, she saw him standing by the orchard fence with the same posture he had at 18, but his shoulders seemed heavier, as if carrying something he could not put down. She reached out to him, but the dream dissolved, leaving her with the lingering sense that she had forgotten to tell him something important. I rose from bed, she writes, and the house felt too quiet, as if it too had been listening for your voice. Then she writes of the village doctor, an older man with a stooped back who had treated her since she was a girl. He visited the house that morning, carrying his worn leather bag, and told her in a gentle voice that she must take better care of herself. He mentioned her cough, the one she had been dismissing for weeks, saying it was only the cold. She writes that he listened to her chest, frowning slightly, before telling her she needed to rest more often. She laughed it off, she admits, because rest is a luxury most mothers of soldiers do not allow themselves. But when he left, she felt a tremor in her ribs that worried her more than she let on. She moves quickly from her own health, as if uncomfortable lingering there. Her words pivot to news from the regiment, a letter delivered to the village post by a courier passing through. The letter mentioned reassignment orders, units shifting toward a more dangerous front. She writes that she asked if her son's battalion was among those listed, but the postman had not known. Still, a seed of dread took root. She tries to push it away on the page, but it remains, darkening her pen stroke. She writes then of a young woman she saw at the market that afternoon. The woman stood near the ration table, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, holding a small loaf of bread as though it were something precious. When the shawl slipped slightly, the mother noticed her rounded belly beneath it, a pregnancy early enough to hide, late enough to fear. She reminded me of myself, the mother writes, and for a moment I felt something tighten in my chest, not from jealousy or sorrow, but from the sudden memory of how it felt to carry a life that would later walk away into a war I never imagined. She describes how the young woman smiled shyly as she tucked the bread into her basket, a brief glimpse of future and fragility intertwined. The letter begins to turn. There is a hesitation in her writing now, a pause that feels like a heartbeat held too long. She writes, "There is something I must tell you, and I hope I will have the chance to say it to your face when you return." The next line begins with, "Your father." But she scratches it out so forcefully that the nib must have nearly torn the paper. Beneath the darkened line, a faint trace of the original words remains, enough to reveal that she had intended to speak of a debt, one she had carried alone since her husband's death. But she cannot continue. Instead, she starts anew. "There are things you should know," she writes, "but I fear the war has stolen the right moment from us." She mentions a name, a distant relative. Perhaps someone who had once come to the house years ago seeking repayment or restitution. She does not explain what the argument was about, only that she had hidden certain documents to protect her son from inheriting the burden. "When you return," she writes, "I will give you the papers. You may decide for yourself what is yours to carry." Another contradiction appears. She writes that she placed the papers in the wooden box beneath my bed, but earlier in the letter, she had referred to them being kept in the drawer beneath my scarves. The inconsistency stands out sharply now, suggesting she moved them recently or was too tired to recall which hiding place she used. A small but crucial detail that years later will help explain part of the epilogue. Her words turn tender again as she describes the orchard, the way the branches seem to reach like open hands toward the gray sky. She writes that she walked among the trees that morning with a basket over her arm, picking up fallen twigs for the fireplace. She came across the old stump where he used to sit and carve bits of wood into tiny figures, horses, soldiers, sometimes birds when he felt patient. She found one such carving half buried beneath the leaves and held it in her palm. It looked like a bird, she writes, unfinished, its wings only suggested by the knife. I wondered whether you had left it there deliberately, or whether it had slipped from your pocket on a day too full to remember. She carried the carving back to the house and placed it on the windowsill above the sink. She writes that she hoped the morning sun would bring out its shape, though the sky had been too heavy with clouds for that. Then comes the turning point, the true cusp of the letter. She writes that a messenger arrived in the early evening, his breath visible in the cold air, his coat spattered with mud. He bore a note from the field office, only a few lines, informing her that certain soldiers might be moved to a new position within a week. He could not confirm whether her son's name was on the list. He looked at me, she writes, as if choosing between truth and mercy. He chose the latter. She knew it. She describes how she stood at the doorway after he left, wind pressing her shawl against her body, and felt a weight settle on her shoulders. Not despair. She refuses to use that word, but a kind of recognition. I realized, she writes, that I could lose you without ever having told you the one truth that has lived in my heart since the day you were born. That truth comes slowly, hesitantly. She writes that there was a promise she made to her husband long ago, a promise not to reveal the circumstances of a past she tried to bury. She writes of a night filled with arguments, of voices raised in fear and frustration, of her husband insisting that some parts of a family story are better left unsaid. She honored that promise until the day he died, carrying the burden like a stone hidden beneath her clothes. But now, with the war threatening to claim her son as it claimed his father, she finds she can no longer keep the silence intact. She does not state the secret outright. Instead, she approaches it in fragments. She writes of a man who visited the farm before she married, offering help during a season of illness. She mentions a debt repaid not with money, but with trust, with shared labor, with something more fragile than both. She hints that her husband knew more than he admitted, that some truths were woven quietly into the fabric of their lives, but still she stops short of confessing plainly. If you return, she writes, I will place the truth in your hands. If you do not, then let this letter carry at least a part of what I could never say. Her voice softens again, turning toward love as if reaching for warmth in the cold. She writes that she has been keeping his childhood shirt, the one embroidered with his initials, in the cedar chest. She washed it last week, she says, and folded it carefully, smoothing each crease. I could not explain to anyone why I did that, she writes. But mothers sometimes prepare for moments that may never come. She speaks of the scarf she mended for him years ago, the same scarf he wore on the morning he left. She recalls tucking it into his collar just so, tightening it slightly the way she did when he was a boy. She writes that she still has the thread she used to mend it, tucked into a small tin on the kitchen shelf. She sometimes opens the tin just to smell the faint scent of wool and oil that clings to the string. "It smells like winter afternoons," she writes, "and like the way you laughed when you came in from the cold." Another vignette surfaces, a small glint of humanity amid the gathering shadows. She writes of passing the blacksmith shop and seeing him shaping iron in the dim morning light. "Sparks flew like fireflies around his hammer," she says, and for a moment she imagined each spark carrying a prayer skyward. "He was making horseshoes," she writes. "He said he hoped they would be needed again soon, when the war ended and the fields were full of work." She writes that she nodded, even though her throat tightened, because she wanted to believe in a world where such simple hopes were possible. Her thoughts returned to her son again, her heart tightening. She writes that she has heard whispers of soldiers being moved toward a river crossing known for danger, thin ice, unstable banks, deep currents. She says she tries not to listen, but rumors have a way of finding cracks in a mother's armor. "I picture you standing there," she writes, "your breath clouding the air, the sound of water below you. I pray the river is kind." She describes how she stood at the gate that afternoon, watching the frozen path stretch toward the horizon. The sky was pale, the village quiet except for the caw of crows near the church tower. She placed her hand on the gatepost, feeling the rough grain of the wood beneath her palm. "It seemed newly old," she writes, "as though it had aged years in a single season. I suppose I feel the same." Then, unexpectedly, she confesses something that surprises even her pen. She writes that she sometimes resents the candle she lights at dusk, that its small flame feels like both hope and torment. "Some nights," she writes, "I want to blow it out and pretend the world outside does not exist. But I cannot. It is for you, and so it must burn." She shifts toward the letter's true pivot. Her words slow, lengthen, deepen. "I do not want you to be a hero," she writes. "I want you to come home. Not with medals, not with stories, just with all your fingers, your smile, and the way you say my name when you are tired." She mentions that some of the boys in the village speak of glory, of honor, of coming home tall and proud. But she knows her son better. She writes that he never wanted to be a hero, that he carried gentleness like a secret strength. She remembers how he cried when their old dog died, how he buried the small creature with his own hands, pressing the soil gently as if tucking it into sleep. "A boy who can love that deeply," she writes, "is not meant for war." She pauses. The next line is shaky. "If you are afraid, do not be ashamed. I am afraid too." Her writing becomes unsteady as she describes hearing the distant sound of artillery again, closer than before. The ground trembled beneath her feet as she walked through the kitchen. A dish rattled on the shelf, the candle flame bent sideways. She steadied it with her hand, feeling the heat against her skin. She writes that for a moment she imagined the walls crumbling, imagined the house falling around her, imagined the possibility that letters might never reach their intended hearts. The thought made her grip the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. She returns once more to something she had been holding back. She writes that before her husband died, he told her there was a truth she might one day need to share with their son. A truth that might explain the quiet tension that sometimes lived between the boy and the man who raised him. She writes that she hopes the right moment will come, that she hopes he will return soon enough for her to see his face when she speaks the words she has been guarding for years. But then she softens again, curling back toward love with the instinct of a mother who senses the world tightening around her child. She writes about the smell of the kitchen after she baked bread that evening, the warm scent of yeast rising, the crust crackling as it cooled. She says she sliced the loaf and placed a piece in the tin where she keeps things she wants him to find when he returns. "It will be stale by then," she writes, "but the thought of giving it to you warms me." A faint smudge appears on the page before her next lines, as though her hand brushed away a tear. "I want you to know," she writes, "that you are the best thing I ever brought into this world." She mentions hearing horses' hooves on the lane earlier, a supply cart hurrying toward the main road. The sound echoed strangely across the frozen ground. She stood by the window watching the cart disappear into the dusk. The lantern swinging from the wagon flickered like a heartbeat trying to keep pace with the cold. Then comes a sharper shift. She writes that a passing soldier, one on leave, one whose eyes spoke more truth than his words, told the villagers that another offensive was coming. She writes that the soldier warned that letters might not reach their destinations in the coming weeks, that deliveries could be delayed or lost entirely. "I felt the world narrow," she writes, "as if the distance between us widened by miles." She acknowledges her fear openly for the first time. She writes that she fears this letter may not reach him, that she fears she may never place her hand on his cheek again, never smooth his hair, never hear him call her Ma in the quiet way he used to when he was exhausted but trying not to show it. She writes that she fears the war will take him in ways she cannot bear to imagine. But then she writes this: "I will not lose hope. Even if hope becomes a thin thread, I will hold it until my final breath." She begins to speak of an heirloom, a small silver charm shaped like a feather passed down from her mother. She writes that she has tied it to a string and sewn it inside the lining of his childhood scarf, the scarf she gave him on the morning he left. She writes that the charm is meant to guide him home, that her mother believed feathers held prayers in their silence. She writes that she prays the charm will stay close to him, even if it cannot protect him from everything. She returns to the orchard one last time. She describes how the frost sparkled on the branches at dusk, how the trees looked like fragile sculptures of ice and shadow. She writes that she imagined him walking through the orchard with her, laughing softly, telling her stories she would pretend not to worry over. She writes that she imagined the sound of his boots crunching on the ground behind her. She turned once, she says, half expecting to see him. But the orchard remained still. Her words begin to draw toward a close, not a farewell, but something that hovers dangerously close to one. She writes that she must stop writing soon because the lamp oil is nearly gone and the cold has begun to settle into her fingers. She says she will finish the letter tomorrow after she has rested, after she has gathered her strength, but she does not end there. Before setting the pen down, she adds one more confession, one that trembles with truth. "If anything happens," she writes, "know that you were loved every hour of your life. There is no part of this world that does not hold something of you." The final lines grow softer, almost like a whisper captured on paper. "Come home to me, not as a hero, not as a story, as my boy." The ink fades toward the end, the pen running dry. The last stroke trembles, trailing off into a faint, unfinished curve. I lower the page slowly. The coat beside me seems heavier still. It seems holding more than fabric, holding history, holding fear, holding the last breath of a mother's hope. The missing button gleams in the dim light, a silent witness to everything she dared to write and everything she feared to say aloud. The next sheet is shorter, not in length but in breadth. The ink starts strong, yet weakens with each line, as if the night had grown colder, the lamp dimmer, her strength thinner. The paper bears faint marks of pressure where her hand must have pressed down to steady itself. A corner is creased, as though she folded it once, hesitated, then opened it again. Whatever she wrote here, she wrote with a heart that had crossed into a quieter, more dangerous honesty. She begins with a confession of exhaustion. "I did not sleep last night," she writes. "Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the wind push against the house as though it were trying to tell me something." She describes lying awake in the dark, listening to the rafters groan, the kettle ping faintly as it cooled, the old clock ticking beside her bed like a reminder that hours move on even when a mother's fears do not. She says she rose before dawn, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and sat by the cold hearth until she could convince herself to light a fire. Her next lines reach for steadiness. She writes about boiling water for tea, though the leaves are nearly gone. She describes holding the cup between her palms, letting the heat seep into her bones. Outside, the frost lay thick on the ground, the world white and still, a silence so complete she feared it might swallow her whole. She writes that she stepped onto the porch and saw the imprint of a bird's wings in the snow, an impression left behind by a creature startled into flight. "It looked," she writes, "like something trying to rise." She returns to memory, the kind meant to anchor her. She writes of the time he was 10 and insisted on walking alone to the far field to check the traps his father had set. She followed at a distance, letting him believe he was older than he was, watching him walk with serious determination through the tall grass. When he reached the fence, he turned just once, quickly, to look for her. She had hidden herself behind the sycamore tree, but she saw his face, and she knew he had hoped she was near. "You always walked braver when you believed I couldn't see you," she writes, "and yet you always looked for me." Her pen hesitates. The ink grows darker for one stroke, then steadies. She shifts then to the reality pressing at her door. A letter arrived from the neighbor's son at the front, brought by the postman early in the morning. The letter spoke of heavy losses, of men her son's age falling during a night assault. She writes that she could not bring herself to read the letter fully. The words blurred as she tried. She returned it to the neighbor with both hands, silently, because there are moments when grief shared becomes grief multiplied, and she could not bear to multiply anything more that day. She writes of the horses in the village, how 2 were taken by soldiers for transport needs. The sound of hooves echoed through the street, a sharp rhythm cutting through the cold. The villagers stepped aside as the animals passed, their breath rising in white clouds. She writes that she watched the horses disappear around the bend and felt an odd pang of longing, not for travel, but for movement, for any sign that time might carry her toward her son rather than away from him. Then she writes of her own weakening body. The cough again. The fatigue that settles in her limbs like sand. "I do not know if it is worry or illness," she writes, "perhaps both." The doctor's warning echoes faintly between the lines. She mentions she tried to prepare the bread that morning, kneading the dough as she had done countless times, but had to pause midway when her breath caught. She sat at the table, staring at the cracked wood, feeling the tremor in her hands. "I cannot fall ill," she writes. "Not while you are away." Her words pivot, turning toward the reason she resumed writing at dawn. There is something she can no longer keep, something she fears she may not have the chance to explain face to face. "I must tell you," she writes, "before the truth is lost with me." The ink wavers. She writes of a winter many years ago before her husband died, when the farm fell into debt after a failed harvest. She writes of a man, she never names him, who came offering assistance, money, tools, hope. She describes her husband's suspicion, his pride wounded by the offer, his refusal to accept help from anyone outside the family. But she accepted the help secretly, writing that she could not bear to see her child hungry. She says that the man asked for nothing in return then, but later came to claim what he believed was owed. The promise of labor, of partnership, of something closer, more complicated. She writes that her husband learned of it, and though nothing improper happened, the silence between them afterward became a wall neither could breach. She writes that she kept the truth from her son because she feared he would grow to resent his father's bitterness, or worse, her own desperation. She writes that the debt, whatever form it took, was never truly resolved. She had hidden the documents for years, moving them from drawer to box, unable to decide whether truth or silence was the greater mercy. But her voice shifts again before she can say more. She grows softer, smaller. "I want to tell you everything," she writes, "but I want to speak it while looking into your eyes." Then, without warning, something intrudes upon the page. A stain. A faint, irregular shape near the margin, as though a drop of water, or perhaps a tear, fell there before the ink dried. The edges of the mark feather lightly into the fibers, preserving the moment more faithfully than memory ever could. She wipes it away in her own time, perhaps, or tries. But the mark remains. She continues. She writes of the candle she lit that evening, the one she always places near the door. She describes how its light wavered, bending toward the cold air seeping in through a crack in the frame. She writes that the flame reminded her of him, resilient but vulnerable to a single breath of ill wind. She admits that she pressed her hand to the glass panel of the door as if the warmth of her palm could be felt by someone standing on the other side, even if no one was there. She writes next of hearing a sound near the road. Footsteps? A voice? She stepped onto the porch, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, but the road was empty, the air still. Only her heartbeat spoke. Sometimes, she writes, I think the world sends echoes of those we long for. Then her words steady into something like acceptance. I do not know what tomorrow will bring, she writes, but if you are somewhere cold tonight, I pray you feel warmth. If you are somewhere frightened, I pray you feel courage. If you are somewhere wounded, I pray you feel my hands holding yours. Her next line is written more firmly, as if she gathered all her remaining strength. And if you are somewhere between this world and the next, I pray you find your way home to me, even if only in a whisper. She writes of hearing the church bell that evening, a single toll in the distance, a sound she had not expected, slow, mournful, heavy. She does not yet know what it signifies. She does not name it. She merely writes that the bell echoed across the fields and into her chest with a weight she could not shake. Her final paragraph emerges slowly, haltingly. She writes that she will finish the letter tomorrow after she has gathered her thoughts. She writes that she wants to tell him something she has held back for 18 years. Something about the morning he was born, about what she saw in his eyes before he took his first breath, about the vow she made over him while the midwife washed her hands and the snow fell silently outside the window. But she does not finish the sentence. The ink thins. The letters slope. The line breaks mid-word. There is no signature. There is no closing. Only a small mark beneath the final stroke, as though her hand stilled there. I fold the page with care, my chest tightening around the silence she left behind. The coat beside me lies motionless, its seams holding stories she never meant to carry alone. The missing button glints faintly in the lamplight, like a single star waiting for dawn. The final sheet is the thinnest of all, so thin the light passes through it like a veil. The edges are uneven, slightly torn, as if it were ripped from a notebook in haste. The ink begins strong but trails off quickly, the letters less steady, the strokes faint and wandering. This page is not a continuation. It is a last attempt, a final reaching across the dark. She begins with an apology. "I am sorry this letter has grown so long," she writes. "I did not mean to fill so many pages. I only meant to say what my heart cannot hold in silence." The next line trembles. "I fear the winter has taken hold of me." She writes that she woke with a heaviness in her chest, a cold that no fire could warm. She tried to rise, but her limbs felt slow, uncooperative, as though her body had grown tired of waiting. She waited for the feeling to pass, but it did not. She sat by the window instead, watching the frost climb the glass like thin white branches. "The ice draws such delicate lines," she writes. "I wonder if it learned them from the cracks in my heart." Even now she refuses despair. She writes of hope again, small, stubborn, trembling hope. She says she believes he will come home, even if the world insists otherwise. She writes that the orchard will bloom again, that she will make the holiday bread, even if it is late, that she will light the candle each evening until the day he stands in the doorway with the cold on his coat and the road on his boots. Then the ink falters. She writes of the church bell, how it tolled again in the early morning, slow and heavy, carrying across the white fields like a final warning. She writes that she does not know for whom it rang, but she felt the sound move through her bones. She closed her eyes, placed her hand on the windowsill, and whispered his name. "The echo," she writes, answered back. A small vignette emerges, a last petala drifting onto the page. She describes a sparrow she saw on the fence post. Its feathers ruffled against the cold. It hopped twice, shaking the snow from its wings, then flew toward the orchard, small and determined. "Its wings looked too small to carry it far," she writes, "but it flew anyway." She writes then of the scarf, the one she tucked into his coat the morning he left. She confesses that she stitched something into the lining that day, the small silver feather charm from her mother, meant to protect him or guide him or perhaps simply remind him of home. She writes that if he ever feels it against his chest during a march or a night watch, he should know it is her hand resting there, holding him steady, her words slow. There is no mention of her illness now, but her pen reveals it. The lines tilt downward. The ink pools where her hand must have paused too long. She writes of sitting by the fire that morning, but being unable to coax the logs into flame. She writes of the room growing darker, the shadows lengthening before their time. She writes of feeling cold, even beneath her shawl, of a quiet she cannot shake. The truth she tried to speak finally surfaces, though only in fragments. "I wanted to tell you. I hoped to say it when you came home. There is something about your father. You were born with more love than truth. I never meant for you to carry my debts." The sentences start, but do not finish. Each one breaks like a branch under frost. She scratches out one line so heavily the paper nearly splits. Whatever she meant to say, she could not bear to write it. The ink grows faint now, almost disappearing. She writes of the orchard one last time, how the branches shimmered under a thin layer of ice, catching the weak morning light. She says she stood at the window with her hand on the glass, imagining him walking between the rows. She describes hearing the sound of footsteps in the snow, light, distant. But when she looked, the path was empty. Then comes the moment the entire letter has been circling. I heard a knock at the door. The line stands alone, slightly slanted, the pen stroke uneven. She writes that she rose slowly, steadying herself on the table. She walked toward the sound, her breath thin, her heart unsure. She reached for the latch with trembling fingers, but she does not describe who stood there. She does not say whether it was the postman, or a neighbor, or a messenger, or someone else entirely. She simply writes, "I am not ready." Then faintly, "I fear I know." Her next words are so thin they are almost invisible. "If this letter never reaches you, my boy, if the road turns you away from this house, if the world takes you from me before I can speak the truth I owe you, then let this be what remains. You were loved more fiercely than I was ever able to say." The ink breaks. A small blot marks the space after the last word, as though her hand fell still there. One final line follows, not shaky, but slow, as though written with the last of her strength. "Come home to me in whatever way you can." There is no signature, no date, no closing. Only a faint imprint where her hand must have rested, a small crescent of pressure on the page. The letter ends, and the silence that follows is almost a sound of its own.